This a human memory, this a pencil sketch. Over time, the lines blur, the graphite flakes away, and you're left with a blank sheet. But there are memories burned in with acid. They don't fade. They eat through the paper. They leave holes in your reality that you can't patch up with a simple "I'm sorry." Names don't matter anymore. Names are for people with a future, for people who still have a place in the sun. Here, in this room, I am just a witness. A man who decided to peek through the keyhole of his own life and went blind from what he saw. You think you know the person sleeping on the pillow next to you? You think the breath you hear in the dark belongs to an ally? You believe that the skin you touch every night is a sacred map you've studied for years. You think you can predict their next move, their next smile. I thought so too. I was comfortable. I was safe. I lived in a world of clean lines and predictable shading. Until that Thursday, until the ink of my life began to bleed from the first drop of poison. Everything was perfect, so perfect it should have terrified me. Marina was my anchor. You know those people, they're like a clean white sheet. Pure, predictable, reliable. When she smiled, it was like the sun coming up on a Sunday morning. No shadows, no hidden corners. We lived together for 7 years. 7 years of sketching a shared future. I remember the smell of the graphite as I drew our house on the napkins in cafes. I remember the way she looked when we talked about the dog we'd get or the daughter who would start first grade. We weren't just living, we were creating a masterpiece. Or so I thought. But then the lines began to break. It wasn't a sudden snap. It was a slow, agonizing erosion. 1,000 tiny scratches that eventually tore the paper. It started with small things, the phone, which now always lay face down. It used to be tossed anywhere on the couch, the kitchen counter, the floor. It was just a tool. Now it was a safe full of secrets. A black glass rectangle that she guarded like a holy relic. When a notification popped up, she'd jump. Not a guilty jump, but a frantic one. Like a person trying to put out a fire before anyone sees the smoke. I'd watch her from across the room. I'd see the blue light of the screen reflecting in her eyes. And for a second, she looked like a stranger. A ghost communicating with another world. When I'd ask who it was, she'd say, "Just work," or "spam." But the lie was drawn in shaky lines. I could see the smudge of guilt on her forehead. I began to notice the patterns. The way she would take her phone into the bathroom and stay there for 20 minutes, the sound of the water running just to mask the silence of her typing. I would stand outside the door, my ear pressed against the wood, feeling like a thief in my own hallway. I could hear the faint click-click of the virtual keyboard. Each tap was a nail in the coffin of our trust. I wanted to burst in. I wanted to demand the truth. But I was afraid. I was afraid that if I saw the screen, the world I had drawn so carefully would dissolve instantly. Then the smell, a faint unfamiliar scent in the car. It wasn't just perfume. It was the smell of someone else's presence. A mix of ozone, expensive tobacco, and a confidence that didn't belong to me. You know that smell. It's the kind that no cologne can wash away. The kind that sticks to the fabric of your life and whispers that you're being replaced. I'd sit in the driver's seat after she'd used the car, and I'd feel like a trespasser. I began to inspect the seats. I'd look for a stray hair, a drop button, anything that could serve as a physical anchor for my floating anxiety. I found a strand of dark hair on the headrest. It was too thick to be hers. It was a jagged black line across my vision. I held it between my fingers, feeling the coarse texture of another man's life. And then came the cold. Not the cold from outside, the cold in bed. When you reach out to touch the shoulder of the person closest to you and hit a concrete wall. She was there, physically. I could hear her heart beating, but her thoughts were miles away. I started noticing how she looked at me, or rather how she didn't look at me. I became background noise, an old piece of furniture that's too much trouble to throw away, but no one sits on anymore. I was the static on the television, the hum of the refrigerator. In her eyes, once clear and bright, a fog appeared, an inky haze of lies that distorted everything I said. Every conversation felt like a performance. How was your day? Fine. What do you want for dinner? Anything. The words were just empty shapes on a page. There was no color left in them. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. Maybe I was the one changing. Maybe I was the one changing. Maybe I was the one drawing shadows where there were none. But the truth doesn't lie. Facts are hard, cold lines. One day I found a receipt. Just a scrap of paper in her coat pocket. I wasn't even looking for it. I was just looking for my keys. Dinner for two at a restaurant on the waterfront. A place with dim lights and white tablecloths. A place where you go to say things you don't want anyone else to hear. Tuesday, 7:45 p.m. At that time, she was supposedly at her mother's helping her with the garden. I held that paper and it felt like it was burning my fingers. I didn't scream. I didn't make a scene. My throat felt like it was filled with dry charcoal. I just stood there in the hallway, the coat still in my hand, listening to her hum a tune in the shower. A tune I didn't recognize, a tune she'd learned from him. The steam from the shower drifted under the door, smelling of her betrayal. I went to my desk. I took out a fresh notebook. I sharpened my pencil until the tip was like a needle. I became the observer of my own shame. If she was going to rewrite our story, I was going to document every single stroke. I began to watch. It's a strange feeling spying on the woman you love. It's like drawing a portrait of a person that was slowly turning into a monster before your eyes. Every time she said she was staying late at work, I'd mark a dark stroke on the page. I'd check the mileage on the car. I'd check the credit card statements. Every time she came home smelling of expensive wine and guilt, the ink in my notebook grew thicker, darker, more oppressive. I started staying up late. I'd sit in the dark living room, watching the headlights of passing cars sweep across the ceiling. I was waiting for her to slip up. I was waiting for the mask to fall. I felt like a criminal at my own house. I began to realize that paranoia is just a higher form of awareness. I bought a tracker, a small black plastic bug. I felt sick to my stomach as I hid it under the passenger seat of her car. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped it. But a case requires facts. It doesn't care about your trembling hands, it only cares about the truth. And the truth was hidden in the GPS coordinates of a city that was no longer mine. I would spend my nights staring at the glowing red dot on my tablet. It moved through streets I knew, stopped at places I didn't. Each stop was a puncture wound in my soul. I watched the dot remain stationary for hours at a time, knowing exactly what was happening in those quiet, static moments. The dot on the screen wasn't just a coordinate anymore. It was a pulse. I became a slave to that flickering red light. I stopped going to the office. I told them I was sick, and in a way, I was. I was infected with the need to know. Spent 18 hours a day in my car, parked in different spots, hidden behind a veil of rain and cigarette smoke. I learned the language of the city's shadows. I knew which streetlights flickered at 3 a.m. and which alleys smelled of damp cardboard and old regrets. I began to keep a secondary log, a thick, leather-bound book where I didn't just write facts, but I drew them. I drew the hotel curtains. I drew the way the light in room 312 looked from the street, a sickly yellow glow that seemed to mock me. I drew the silhouette of the man as he walked to his car. I never saw his face clearly, so I drew him as a void, a man-shaped hole in the universe, a smudge of charcoal that was slowly erasing my existence. One night, the tracker led me to a park, a quiet, upscale place where the trees were manicured and the paths were lined with stone. I watched them from behind a thick oak tree. They were walking slowly, their shoulders touching. I saw him reach into his pocket and pull out a small gift box tied with a red ribbon. I watched her open it, her face lighting up with the joy I hadn't seen in half a decade. I felt like I was watching a movie of my own life, but someone had swapped the lead actor. I took out my sketchbook right there in the dark. My hands were freezing, the graphite snapping under the pressure. I drew the red ribbon. I drew it as a trail of blood winding through the white paper. I realized then that I wasn't just the husband anymore. I was a ghost watching a haunting. I was the one who didn't belong. The park, the lights, the woman, they were all part of a new sketch, and I was just a smudge on the margin waiting to be rubbed out. I started following him too. The man with no face. I followed him to his office, to his gym, to his own home. He had a life. He had a wife of his own. He had a garden and a mailbox and a routine. We were two men sharing the same lie, but only one of us knew the price. I sat outside his house one evening watching him mow his lawn. He looked so normal, so predictable. It made me want to scream. How could someone so ordinary cause so much destruction? I drew him as a monster, made of everyday objects, a head made of bricks, arms made of garden shears. I was losing my grip on reality. The lines between what I saw and what I felt were bleeding into each other. Back at home, the silence was becoming a physical weight. Every time Marina walked through the front door, I'd smell the park on her. I'd smell the hotel soap. I'd see the red ribbon hidden in her jewelry box. We would sit across from each other at the dinner table, and the space between us felt like a vast, empty canyon. I'd watch her chew her food, and I'd wonder if she could taste the ink on my breath. I began to hallucinate. I'd look at the wallpaper and see her face melting into the patterns. I'd look at my own hands and see them covered in permanent black ink. Even when I hadn't touched a pen in hours, I was becoming the archive. Every memory, every touch, every word we'd ever shared was being recategorized as a precursor to betrayal. Our first date? A setup for this? Our wedding? A performance for this? The birth of our dreams? An abortion in progress. I spent a whole week just watching her sleep. I'd sit in a chair in the corner of the bedroom, a shadow in the dark, watching the rise and fall of her chest. I'd imagine the dreams she was having. I'd imagine him in those dreams. I felt like a spider at the center of a web, but I was the one trapped in the silk. I was waiting for a sign, a confession, a slip of the tongue, but she was perfect. Her lies were a fortress of smooth, unbroken lines. She was the best artist I'd ever known, and she was painting my execution in real time. By the third week, I was a shell. I had stopped bathing. I stopped answering the phone. My world was the red dot, the sketchbook, and the cold, hard realization that my life was a work of fiction. I was preparing the final entry. I was gathering the last pieces of the puzzle. I found his name. I found his address. I found the dates of every meeting for the last 6 months. It wasn't just an affair. It was a parallel life. They had their own jokes, their own songs, their own future. I was just the landlord of the house she used for sleep. The weight of the evidence was crushing me. I had over 200 photos. I had hours of GPS logs. I had receipts for gifts I never received. I looked at the folder and saw a monster, a thick, black beast that was ready to consume us both. I knew that once I showed it to her, there would be no going back. The sketch would be torn, the ink would be spilled, but I couldn't live in the gray anymore. I needed the black and white. I needed the final, jagged line. The first night I followed the signal to the hotel. The sky was a bruised purple. The air tasted like wet graphite and exhaust. I saw her car under a flickering street lamp, and then I saw her. She stepped out of the lobby, wearing a silk dress I'd never seen. She looked alive in a way that made my stomach turn. She wasn't looking for me. She was looking for him. He appeared from the shadows. A tall, blurry figure. He reached out and touched her waist, and she leaned into him. I watched as they disappeared back inside. The rain began to fall harder, washing away the last of my delusions. I stood there until I was soaked to the bone. I walked back to my car, my shoes squelching in the mud, feeling like I'd just witnessed my own funeral. The engine roared to life, but I didn't move. I just sat there, the wipers rhythmic like a heartbeat, watching the hotel entrance until the lights in their room went dark. For days, I walked around the house like a ghost. Every object in our home had a double meaning now. The coffee mugs we bought on vacation, were they symbols of love or just props in a long-running play? The bed we shared, was it a sanctuary or a crime scene? I found myself touching the walls, feeling the texture of the paint, wondering if the lies had seeped into the very structure of the building. I would stand in the kitchen and stare at the nights, thinking about how easy it would be to cut through the fabric of the reality I lived in. But I didn't want blood. I wanted clarity. I wanted to see the look on her face when the ink finally hit the paper. I was a man, waiting for a storm I had created myself. I began to study her face in the mornings. While she was putting on her makeup, I would watch her reflection in the mirror. I'd see her applying layers of foundation, covering the cracks in her own story. She was so meticulous, so careful. I wondered if she ever felt the weight of it. Did she ever wake up and forget which version of herself she was supposed to be? Did she ever look at me and see the man she was erasing? Or was I already gone in her mind, replaced by a smudge of gray that she just hadn't got around to rubbing out yet? The more I watched, the more I realized that I didn't know her at all. The Marina I loved was a sketch I had drawn myself, and the real woman was someone I would never understand. The nights were the hardest. The house would grow quiet, and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock in the hallway. I would lie awake, listening to her breathing. Sometimes she would talk in her sleep, whispers I couldn't understand, names that weren't mine. I would clench my fists until my nails drew blood from my palms, trying to stay anchored to the present. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of black ink, and the only thing keeping me afloat was the anger. The cold, sharp anger that was slowly replacing my heart. I was becoming a weapon, a jagged, ink-stained blade designed for one purpose: to cut the lie out of my life. I started visiting the places they went. After the red dot moved on, I would drive to the cafes and the parks. I would sit in the same chairs they sat in. I would order the same drinks. I wanted to see what they saw. I wanted to breathe the same air. I found a napkin at one cafe with a small drawing on it. A heart drawn in blue ink. Was it hers? Was it his? I tucked it into my binder, another piece of the puzzle. I felt like a detective in a noir film, but there was no hero in this story. Only victims and architects of pain. The city became a map of their betrayal. Every corner was a memory of a lie. Every street was a path to a hotel room. I began to realize that the affair wasn't just about sex. It was about the thrill of the rewrite. They were creating a new world together, one where I didn't exist. They were building a fortress out of secrets, and every secret they kept was a stone added to the wall between me and her. I felt the weight of that wall every day. It wasn't visible, but it was stronger than any brick and mortar. I could push against it all I wanted, but it wouldn't budge. The only way through was to blow it up, and I had the explosives right there in my black folder. I just needed the right moment to pull the trigger. The day before the confrontation, I went to my studio and destroyed everything. I tore up the sketches of our house. I smashed the models of our future. I poured black ink over every drawing I had ever made of her. I wanted to clear the space. I wanted the world to be as empty as I felt. I sat in the middle of the mess, my hands covered in graphite, and I realized that I was finally free. I had nothing left to lose. The sketch was ruined. The paper was torn. All that was left was the truth, and the truth was a cold, dark place where nothing grows. I was ready. The final confrontation happened on a Tuesday, a month to the day since I found that first scrap of paper. I invited her to dinner. I told her I'd cooked her favorite lamb with rosemary. I spent all afternoon setting the scene. I didn't use candles. I used the harsh, sterile light of the dining room chandelier. I wanted every shadow to be sharp. I wanted nowhere for the lies to hide. In the center of the table where the flowers should have been, I placed the folder. A thick black binder filled with every photo, every log, every piece of thermal paper I'd collected. It was my masterpiece, my life's work. When she walked in, she looked exhausted. She dropped her bag and gave me that rehearsed, weary smile. "Smells great, honey," she said. Then she saw the binder. She stopped. The air in the room seemed to vanish. I watched the color drain from her face, leaving her as pale as the paper I used for my sketches. "What is this?" she whispered. Her voice was like a thin line drawn by a dying pen. "It's our life, Marina," I said. My voice was steady, devoid of emotion. "The real version. Not the one you've been telling me. I've been keeping records. I've been drawing the shadows you thought were hidden. Look at it. Look at the art you've created." She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat down still in her coat and began to flip through the pages. The sound of the paper turning was like thunder in the silent room. She saw herself in the hotel lobby. She saw the GPS maps. She saw the GPS maps. She saw the timestamps. She looked at the photos as if she were looking at a stranger in a horror movie. "Why?" I asked. It was the only word I had left, the only word that mattered. She looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw her clearly. Her eyes weren't foggy anymore. They were sharp, cold, and filled with a strange kind of relief. "Because you were already gone," she said. "You were so obsessed with your work, with your archives, with capturing life that you forgot to actually live it. You treated me like a model for your sketches, not a woman. He saw me. He didn't want to draw me. He just wanted to hold me. He gave me colors you didn't even know existed. The silence that followed was absolute. We were two ghosts sitting at a table of cold food, surrounded by the ruins of a 7-year-old sketch. Every word she said was like a stroke of black paint over my face. I realized then that in my quest for the truth, I had destroyed the only thing worth saving. I had become the monster I was trying to document. She left that night. She didn't take a suitcase. She didn't take the dog. She just walked up the door with her keys and her secrets. The sound of the door closing was a final period at the end of a very long, very dark sentence. I sat there for hours, the chandelier buzzing above me, staring at the empty chair where my life used to sit. I stayed in the house. I took a large black marker, the kind that never fades, the kind that smells of chemicals and permanent endings. And I went to the bedroom. I started to draw on the white walls. I drew long, jagged lines that covered the photos of our wedding. I blacked out the windows. I wanted to turn the house into a dark, ink-stained cave where the memory of her couldn't breathe. I worked for hours. My fingers were stained black. My clothes were ruined. But I couldn't stop. I had to erase the sketch. I had to smudge the lines until there was nothing left but darkness. Days turned into weeks. I stopped looking in the mirror. I didn't want to see the smudge that was left of my face. I lived in the silence. I lived in the archive. I began to realize that the truth doesn't set you free. It just builds a smaller cage, a cage made of cold facts and sharp edges. I started drawing again, but not people, not houses. I drew shadows. I drew the way the light looks when it's dying. I drew the sound of a heart breaking. I realized that my art had changed. It was no longer about life. It was about the absence of it. It was about the holes that betrayal leaves in the paper. I'd walk through the empty rooms and feel the presence of the ghosts. Not just Marina, but the man I used to be. I'd see him in the corner of my eye, the man who thought he was safe. I wanted to warn him. I wanted to tell him to put down the pencil and just hold her, but it was too late. The ink was dry. So here I am, sitting in a room that smells of graphite and old paper. The walls are black. The windows are sealed. It's just me and the archive. If you're listening to this, maybe you're checking your partner's phone right now. Maybe you're wondering why they're staying late. Maybe you're looking for a receipt in a coat pocket. Let me give you some advice. Stop. Don't open the folder. Don't follow the signal. Once you open a file in the archive, you can never close it. Once you see the betrayal, it changes the way you look at everything. A smile is no longer a smile. It's a mask. A touch is no longer a touch. It's a distraction. Every I love you sounds like a draft for a lie. Infidelity isn't just a mistake. It's a rewrite. It takes the story of your life and crosses it all out with a thick black line, and you're left trying to draw something new on a page that's already been destroyed. You're left trying to find a reason to keep the pencil in your hand when all you want to do is snap it in half. My name doesn't matter. I am just a smudge in the archive of broken things. I am the man who looked too closely and lost everything. Be careful what you draw. Be careful who you let into your sketch, because once the ink is dry, once the lines are set, it's forever. And no amount of graphite can ever cover the stain of a life that's been rewritten by someone else. The page is full now. There is no room left for more lines, only the darkness, only the archive. The ink is soaked through the paper, through the table, and into the floor. There is nothing left to say. There is only the silence of the black page and the slow, steady drip of a broken pen. The story is over, the lines are finished, but the stain will never leave. It's part of the paper now, it's part of the archive, and the archive never forgets. It just waits for the next subject, the next sketch, the next sketch, the next rewrite. Don't let it be yours. Put down the pencil. Walk away from the keyhole. Some things are better left in the shadows, where the ink can't find them, because once you turn on the light, everything changes, and you can never go back to the way it was before. You can never go back to the simple, beautiful lie of a perfect sketch. The end is just a black line, and I finally reached it.